It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. This is going to be a great day for me. These podcasts that I do, these shows with Laura Belin are easy because she's so articulate, particularly for a print journalist. I mean, and she's so informed that I can kind of put my feet up on the desk and just coast when she's on the show. I love Laura Belin. Let's bring that back up on screen. Laura Belin is the curator. She is the executive editor, the CEO of Bleeding Heartland. It's a community blog providing original reporting and commentary about Iowa politics, especially campaigns and elections, state government, social and environmental issues. And everybody knows those are the things that we talk about a lot on Podcast by George. Bleeding Heartland also covers what the Iowans in Congress are up to, and a lot of times it's no good, and she shines a light on that. We're going to be talking about some of that today. Any federal, state, or local policies of interest to Iowa readers you'll find in Bleeding Heartland. She's been the site's primary author and the sole editor since 2008. My God, that makes me feel old. I just can't believe that it's 2008. But we're going to be talking about a lot of things today. And actually, it's kind of a happy, good news day. There hasn't been a lot of good news lately, and we're finally going to get some, I think, by way of the state of Kansas, which is kind of surprising in some different respects. And we'll talk about that too. But let's welcome her in, bring her on to the show. Laura Belin, welcome back to Podcast by George.
Thanks, George. Always good to talk with you.
Yeah, I mean, we're off to a good week here. I think it's good news here coming out of the state of Kansas. Let me go right to Bleeding Heartland here and bring this up. We got some happy humans here. I don't know where you got this photograph, but I love this shot. 4 takeaways for Iowa from the pro-choice vote in Kansas. Now, a lot of people have heard about this, but I want to get your 4 takes on this. And we're going to start here with this opening paragraph that I'll read. In a huge victory for bodily autonomy, Kansas voters August 2nd overwhelmingly rejected, August 2nd, just 2 days ago, overwhelmingly rejected a proposed constitutional amendment that would have cleared a path for Republican lawmakers down there to ban abortion. With about 95% of the votes counted, it's probably higher by now, the no vote against removing abortion protections from the Kansas Constitution led the yes vote by 58.8% to 41.2%. Wow. I mean, I headlined this as a jaw-dropping development down there in Kansas. Even the most optimistic, I didn't think that was going to happen, I don't think. Iowa Democrats and Republicans should pay attention to the results, you say. Now, here's the first take. So let's start here, Laura. The abortion issue has potential to drive up turnout. Okay, so talk about that.
First, I just want to briefly say where the photo came from. I went to the social media of Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. That was the group, the umbrella organization that was running the campaign, the no campaign against this amendment in cooperation with many other groups. And this was actually a photo from a few weeks ago from after they had some kind of phone bank or postcard writing event, and they took a picture. So they had a small volunteer army down there working really hard to make this happen. But I saw it when you said jaw dropping, it absolutely was. Last night on MSNBC, I saw they were interviewing one of the campaign managers for this Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. And she said they weren't even anticipating. They thought the scenarios, they thought it could be a close win, a close loss. They even thought it was possible it could be a fairly significant win for the yes side, but they never anticipated a double-digit win for their position.
And so, like I said, it's a reason to rejoice a little bit. I mean, it's Kansas, and it's exclusive to that state. It does have some far-reaching implications, particularly for the midterms and maybe beyond. Mm-hmm. And that's where this first slide that I had up here, let me bring it back here, that I wanted to bring in, because the abortion issue has the potential to drive up turnout. And you know better than most that that's extremely important because for Democrats, because they tend to fare well when turnout is high.
Yes. And the last 5 midterm elections in Iowa, the Democratic turnout has lagged behind the Republican turnout. So, in general, Republicans are more reliable voters in a midterm election. And it is one of the biggest challenges facing Democrats this year. This turnout in Kansas was higher than the general election of 2014. It was approaching the general election of 2008 turnout. And the Republicans had scheduled this referendum on the day of the primary, hoping that they would get low turnout. That was the
Yeah.
strategy because they knew that the position of banning abortion is unpopular. And so they were trying to hide the ball with a very confusingly worded amendment, confusing wording on the ballot, putting it on the day of a primary. But about 20% of the people who showed up to vote just cast a ballot on that constitutional amendment. They didn't even vote in either the Democratic or Republican primaries for Senate or governor. So a lot of people were highly motivated. And I think that the obvious explanation is the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And now we're just hit with a slew almost every day, another tragic story of some woman in some state that banned abortion a person who can't get the medical care that she needs, whether it's for an ectopic pregnancy or a miscarriage or, a 10-year-old rape victim who has to travel to another state. And we've even seen the people who aren't pregnant or having issues getting prescriptions for a drug that's used to treat rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And it can also be used to induce abortion. So it's been hard for some people to get their prescriptions refilled. I mean, it's just a nightmare. And people came out to vote and said they don't want this coming to Kansas.
Well, I'm shocked and appalled. I'm mortified. My wife is apoplectic. I mean, when she sees these stories that you're talking about, my God, I mean, that strikes horror and dread and terror in the hearts of defenders of the right to choose. Um, let me talk a little bit about this situation with the voting down there, because you mentioned it, but this is what jumped out at me about the 20% or so that didn't they couldn't vote for either party if they wanted to. This brought in people that are not that don't normally vote, maybe. I mean, that's the thing that's really important about this, and why that could be so important to Democrats, because I would like to think anyway that those people would be prone to vote Democratic.
Well, these are people who are not affiliated with either the Democratic or Republican primary or party. And Kansas has what are called semi-closed primaries. So you have to declare a party affiliation to vote. It's similar to Iowa. You have to declare that you're a member of the Democratic or Republican Party to cast a ballot in the primary. But these no party voters, it's a huge share of the population. But in a midterm year, a lot of those people stay home. The drop, what they call the drop off between the presidential year turnout and midterm turnout, it's always a lot bigger drop off for those independent voters than it is for registered Democrats and Republicans. That's just been true for decades. And so if this abortion issue has the potential to turn out a lot of independents, and we know from other opinion polling that independents, the majority of them are pro-choice. They think that in most cases, abortion should be legal. They certainly don't support the kind of strict bans that Republicans have been trying to pass all over the country.
Very good. I want to run through these takeaways.
By the way,
here.
it's clear from the numbers in Kansas that a significant number of Republican voters voted against this constitutional amendment. It's hard to exactly calculate that, but I saw some election analysts saying probably at least 20% of the people who did vote in the Republican primary also voted against that amendment. So those would be, for instance, the suburban, moderate, upscale voters. A lot of those people, they might favor Republicans because of tax policy, but they don't want to ban abortion.
Yeah, and who's leading their party? I mean, who's wagging the dog here? And this is what this next take is. Many Republicans don't want to ban abortion. Very few pro-choice Republicans hold public office anymore. But in the GOP rank and file, many don't want to give lawmakers a free hand to ban abortion. And that's what also jumped out about this overwhelming margin down there in Kansas. I mean, it looks like this is something that the politicos are controlling, and worse than that, the Supreme Court.
Yes, and there have always been a significant number of Republican voters who were pro-choice. But I can say in Iowa, where I followed the legislature very closely, the last pro-choice Republican to serve in the legislature retired in 2008. And there was one before that who lost her GOP primary in 2006. So there's just no space to be a politician or a candidate in the Republican Party and be pro-choice. And yet, within their base,
Yeah.
a lot of people, they don't want the government making these healthcare decisions. And especially now that we see what's happening, the woman in Wisconsin who had to keep bleeding for 10 days because she couldn't demonstrate that she was close to death. I mean, it's just a nightmare for people. Nobody wants to think about going through that, or someone they love going through that. And Kansas is a state that voted for Donald Trump over Joe Biden by about 15 points. It was about a 56%, 41% margin. Iowa voted for Trump by about 8 points, 53 to 45% margin in 2020. So, if Kansans really don't want to ban abortion, we can see from Iowa polling, and it's pretty likely that an amendment like this wouldn't pass in Iowa.
And I think we're going to get to some of that here. Now, let me bring this up. You say there's no guarantee that Kansas results would be replicated in Iowa, but a majority of our red-leaning states' residents do support reproductive rights. You mentioned that. I had to ask you about this too. I mean, do you have to think about that when you write? Are we red-leaning or are we red? Iowa.
I wrote after the 2020 election, I wrote a piece called Iowa's Not a Swing State Anymore. I don't think that you can truly call us a swing state, but I think that Kansas might be a little bit more Republican than we are. But I think that we're in that mode where some Democrats can get elected to statewide office. It's not impossible. It's not a state like Mississippi or Alabama where it's almost impossible for a Democrat to get elected. But certainly in a neutral environment, you would have to say now that Republicans are favored in Iowa. But as recently as 2018, Democrats were elected in 3 of our 4 congressional districts. So I don't know whether you want to call us, I would probably still call us red leaning rather than a red state, but I wouldn't call us a swing state right now.
And trying to draw some comparisons here between Iowa and Kansas. Now, Kansas will jump up and surprise you once in a while because it's kind of like Iowa on steroids. They've got this,
Yeah.
this hinterland, this rural area, and then they've got major metropolitan and suburbia areas. I mean, major metropolitan. They've got Kansas City right there, and the Topeka and Wichita. Some big cities. Iowa is kind of like that, and so I mean, there are some comparisons to be drawn demographically.
Definitely. I mean, they were ahead of us in terms of going all in on the extreme tax cuts. And unfortunately, our Republicans who control the legislature chose not to learn anything from the experience in Kansas. But the pendulum started to swing back where they elected a Democratic governor in 2018 because the Republican trifecta down there had done so much damage to the state budget. I mean, their schools were just drastically underfunded because of the steep tax cuts. And we're probably going to be in that situation in a few years once a lot of the federal aid to states that started during the pandemic runs out. Our state budget is probably going to be in a dire situation.
Okay, so here now this is another major take here. We touched on that a little bit. Abortion bans are toxic in the suburbs, and this goes when I start talking suburbs. I start thinking about Captain Butt Crunch, as I call him, Donald Trump, because he doesn't do very well in the suburbs, particularly with suburban women. At least that's what I'm thinking anyway, and that kind of sunk his battleship in 2020. It says Johnson County, Kansas contains much of the Kansas City suburbs. Biden did relatively well there, taking 52.7% of the vote, 44.5% for Trump. The constitutional amendment went down in flames with no beating yes by, and as you mentioned, that margin of 68% to 32% in that demographic and that geographic.
Yes. I mean, Kansas is much more dominated by that population in the Kansas City suburbs than Iowa is by the Des Moines metro area. So I was, of course, following a lot of the election analytics on Twitter on Tuesday night. And I saw somebody say that in this Johnson County, that is this large suburban county, when they saw that the early votes were counted and there was a 50,000 vote margin for the no side, there were people who were already saying there's no way yes can make up that difference. That's just too large a difference. But I'm looking at that and saying, if I'm Cindy Axne running for reelection, and she was elected by narrow margins in 2018, 2020. And the election was clearly decided in the suburbs of Des Moines, Ankeny, and the western suburbs that are in Polk and Dallas County. And so that's going to be the critical battleground for her. It's a 21 county district, but 75% of the population is in Polk County or Dallas County. So if I'm Cindy Axne, I'm spending every day telling people that Zach Nunn already voted to ban almost all abortions after 6 weeks. And during one of the primary debates against his Republican opponents, when Dave Price of WHO TV asked people to raise their hands if they would support an abortion ban with no exceptions, his hand went up. So that's what you're going to get if you elect a Republican Congress. There's already talk, if Republicans take control of both houses of Congress, that they could try to pass a nationwide abortion ban, which definitely would not be popular. But Zach Nunn is on record supporting abortion bans. So I just think that this is Kansas, not Iowa, but there's no reason to think that Iowa suburban voters aren't just as pro-choice as Kansas suburban voters. And I live in the suburbs myself, and that's my perception, that the Republicans here are not all in on the social conservative agenda.
On the Zach Nunn guy, I mean, he's one of your quintessential punching down Republicans on the ticket against Axne, as you mentioned. Now, how much of a margin is there? How much could this turnout in the metro help her? Is there room, a lot of room there for her to turn out more that would make a big difference? Or has she pushed that envelope pretty hard in her last time out?
That's a great question, because she was elected twice in very high turnout environments. The 2018 midterm turnout, it was really high on both sides. The Democratic turnout was way higher than 2010 and 2014. And the Republican turnout was a little bit higher than those other midterms. Of course, Republicans already had very high turnout because there were red wave elections in 2010 and 2014. So they didn't have as much room to go up. But she already was elected in 2020, huge turnout election, of course, set a modern day turnout record. So I would say that she needs a very strong turnout in the Des Moines Metro to be reelected. And again, the third district, the new district, it does contain 21 counties, and you can't discount the rural counties because she's got to keep Zach Nunn's margin down in those. But really what she needs is to run up the score in Polk County and Dallas County, and then just keep from being blown out everywhere else. But we saw in Kansas that in some of these counties where Donald Trump got 60, 70% of the vote for banning abortion was a lot lower than that. Now, we don't know, a lot of those voters may prefer a Republican candidate for Congress, but I don't think there's any downside for Cindy Axne to go all over this district. And of course, she should talk about other issues as well, and infrastructure spending, and how Zach Nunn voted to cut unemployment benefits. I mean, there's any number of issues that she can talk about where she's probably on the side of public opinion. But this one, I don't think that she or any other Democrat running for office should be afraid to be out there saying, I will protect the right to have a legal abortion, and this decision to be between patients and doctors, and not something that's left up to Republican legislatures and governors.
Well, I've had Cindy Axne on the show before. People can go back and see that on an archival basis. I mean, I had been a supporter. I'm not as warm to Cindy Axne as I used to be, primarily because of defense spending. I wish that she would be firmer against that. I wish she would do more on the climate. But I mean, she's got to do with what she has to work with. Obviously, I understand that. And it has to do with the two-party system. And my God, it's a hell of a lot better than Zach Nunn, as I mentioned. But we're not going to get into all of that today. I wanted to.
Well, Cindy Axne is not on the left of the Democratic caucus.
I know.
I when I think they run ads that make her sound like a socialist or something.
I know.
She's not like AOC. I mean, although they will compare her to AOC,
yeah,
very solidly in the moderate Democratic bent. And I probably am also to the left of where she is, but I would have to say that she's probably fairly well aligned with suburban voters in Iowa, I would think.
Okay, so now this one you're going to have to explain, because this is getting a little above my pay grade. But Republicans may think twice about trying to amend Iowa's constitution. Okay, were they planning on doing that, and do they really need to do that because of what's happened in the courts?
Well, they already are halfway to getting that on a ballot. So they were not able to get that on the ballot for this year because in 2020, they didn't have the votes in the Iowa House to get this constitutional amendment through. And in Iowa, it's pretty difficult to amend the state constitution. You have to have two separately elected legislatures approve an amendment. Then it goes on a statewide ballot. But in 2021, both the Iowa House and the Senate did approve an amendment that would say that there is no constitutional right in Iowa to abortion or state funding for abortion. And they did that to try to overturn the Iowa Supreme Court's 2018 decision, which said the Iowa Constitution does protect abortion as a fundamental right. And that was seen as a backstop for here in case the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And then, as you alluded to, in June, a week before the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, the Iowa Supreme Court majority, now a majority appointed by Kim Reynolds, overturned its own 2018 precedent. So they didn't go as far as the US Supreme Court did in saying, yes, states can definitely ban abortion, but they did say that abortion is not a fundamental right under Iowa's Constitution. So it's a little bit up in the air. That case that they were deciding went back to the lower court, and eventually, in a couple of years, it'll find its way back to the Iowa Supreme Court. And no one really knows whether the Iowa Supreme Court will take the position of the US Supreme Court, then basically give the legislature a free hand, or whether they will come up with some kind of balancing test similar to what the US Supreme Court established in Casey that would say, well, states can regulate abortion, but it can't pose an undue burden to the person seeking to terminate a pregnancy. So we don't really know. So Republicans might think that they would be better off passing a constitutional amendment that says there is no right to abortion at all in Iowa's Constitution. But now, looking at this Kansas result, and the Des Moines Register polling by Ann Seltzer has already shown that this constitutional amendment Republicans are proposing in Iowa is unpopular. But they might have thought in the past, well, we can, with confusing ballot wording and scheduling the vote at a time with low turnout or something, we can maybe slip this through. But now, in this political context, where there are all these horror stories from states that ban abortion, I don't think they're going to be able to trick Iowans into thinking, oh, well, this really doesn't change much, and this is just neutral. That's what Republicans have said. Oh, this wouldn't ban abortion. Our amendment wouldn't ban abortion. It would just make the Constitution neutral on the subject of abortion. But everyone knows the only purpose of the amendment is to allow the legislature to ban abortion. So I think it would be difficult to sustain that. Now, I don't think anyone should be complacent about it, because you don't know what can happen. And I mean, we just saw very high turnout. That's not a guarantee that there would always be high turnout in a referendum on abortion rights. But if I'm a Republican legislator, I may be thinking that next year, maybe I don't want to pass this amendment again and put it on the statewide ballot in 2023 or 2024. We just don't know. They might want to wait and see what the Iowa Supreme Court does when this case gets back around to it in probably a year or two.
God, is she any good, folks? Because I'm listening to this in my headphones while she's talking. I mean, this is network quality articulation that we're talking here. I mean, for a print journalist, I can't believe how well you present these facts in broadcast quality, Lauren. And where else are you going to get this kind of analysis? I want to tell people to go to bleedingheartland.com, because we're talking about, local, state, and federal electoral issues here. And then you get this judicial analysis, that Laura has a handle on and knowledge about. I mean, the daughter of the great David Belin. I mean, this is great stuff. I mean, it really is. Where else are you going to get this? This is really cool. All right.
Well, thanks, George. I have a radio show weekly, so I do have some experience in radio, even though I haven't primarily worked in radio, but it is a different format from the written word. You're right.
I worked with dozens, maybe over 100 people in radio. Not many of them could spit it out the way that you do. Let me bring this up on screen here. This last slide here. Okay, this goes to what you were talking about here. I mean, that pretty much lays it out in print about the constitutional amendment. Okay, that's good. Now, the other thing I wanted to do here, because again, we're talking about being left. Now, I'm left of the Democratic Party. I'm left of Laurel. I wanted to bring this up and read this now, and I got to get it big enough that I can see it. Now, this is always an issue for me. Here we go. This is Left Voice. I'm going to encourage people to check that out. Go to bleedingheartland.com first. Check out Laura's writings, but I like Left Voice. I look at this. It says, in a backlash against Dobbs, Kansas votes overwhelmingly to protect abortion. Kansans have overwhelmingly voted to protect abortion rights in their state. There's a huge rejection of the anti-democratic Dobbs decision by the tyrannical Supreme Court. Laura, explain now, why is this going to go down in history as the Dobbs decision?
Because when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, I think a lot of people didn't grasp what that was going to mean, not just for people who want to terminate a pregnancy, but what it was going to mean for all kinds of patients in states that have banned abortion. And now that a dozen or so states have banned abortion, and like I said, we're seeing these horror stories about hospitals not promptly dealing with people who have had miscarriages or ectopic pregnancies, patients having trouble getting the drugs they want. In Texas, there are women who need a prescription to help complete a miscarriage, and the pharmacists don't want to fill the prescription because they're afraid that it might be an intended abortion. I mean, it's just a nightmare. And so this Dobbs decision really brought home to people what it means. And I have no living memory. I mean, I was born before Roe v. Wade, but I have no living memory of a time before Roe v. Wade. So the majority, but a lot of Americans have always taken Roe v. Wade for granted, and they never really thought about it. And now you have people that the Republican nominee for governor of Michigan just said a 14-year-old who's raped should have to carry the pregnancy to term. I mean, this is something that most people do not support, even most Republicans. And so the US Supreme Court, I mean, I do agree that this is a backlash against that. And I think that what was different, we've seen in polling, Dan Guild, who's an occasional guest author at Bleeding Heartland, and he follows presidential approval and congressional generic ballot polling really closely. So it's clear that there was some movement toward Democrats after the Dobbs decision. But the question was, how real is this? Is this just a temporary bounce? Is this something that would actually translate into votes? And now on Tuesday in Kansas, we got the first example of how this might translate into votes. And if anything, it looks like maybe the polling has understated what the real shift has been in the electorate. That a lot of people are just saying, this is not a regime that they want. And Kansas, I forgot to mention this earlier, Kansas is really important not only for the people who live there, because it's also the closest state where abortion is legal for millions of people who live in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, who would find it difficult to travel to Illinois or New York or California, but Kansas is a little bit more within reach. So it's an island that could be extremely important for abortion access going forward.
Let me ask you this. I don't mean to put you on the spot. When I see the Supreme Court coverage like this in regards to abortion, I'm struck, and I don't know if you recall this or not. You got to get in the Wayback Machine, but there's been this news about the Supreme Court justices wanting to be protected outside their homes from protesters, people gathering in the street out there. But am I right in recalling that there was, I think, a Supreme Court ruling down in Missouri or Kansas or someplace like that, where protesters were going to the homes of Planned Parenthood employees down there and raising hell, and the court said that was okay, that they could do that. Is that right or not? Do you remember?
There may have also been a case about what I think that what you might be thinking of is that Massachusetts had a law that established a buffer zone where protesters couldn't be within a certain distance of an abortion clinic or a clinic that provided abortions. And because there was so much harassment of people going into those clinics, and even people going in for a well woman care or whatever STD testing, but they were just being harassed by these crowds. And the US Supreme Court said some years ago in the 2010s, they did say that that law was unconstitutional because the First Amendment allows assembly in public places, including a public sidewalk. So I would say, yes, if people, I mean, it's not something that I choose to do, go in front of somebody's home to protest. But I think if people are in a public street or on a public sidewalk, peacefully protesting outside a Supreme Court justice's home, I think the First Amendment protects that.
Yeah, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this article here in Left Voice, but I wanted to bring this up because there was something in here that I had not been aware of. Kansans have voted to protect abortion rights in their state. Yes, Kansas, the deep red state where Trump won by more than 15 percentage points, as Laura said. Last election cycle, voted to protect abortion rights down there. In fact, Kansas has a history of violence against abortion providers. Again, in the Wayback Machine, Laura, you would recall this, the murder of abortion doctor George Tiller. That was back in 2009. So the fact that this vote wasn't even close is even more startling when you put it in historical context.
And there was violence in Kansas in even the 1990s, Operation Rescue, and there were a lot of very vicious anti-abortion protesters down there. So yes, Kansas definitely has a history of violence. And it's interesting that the voters, again, comprehensively rejected this. And even a lot of voters in those red counties, red areas of Texas or of Kansas said, this is not what we want for our state.
All right, good. Let me move on here because we mentioned the kingfish here very briefly. Briefly, that's what I call her, the kingfish. Kingfish Kim Reynolds. Let me bring this up again. This is right out of Bleeding Heartland. Okay, before we leave this topic, I mean, put on your Kim Reynolds boots for a while. I mean, you probably don't want to do that, but what's she thinking looking at that Kansas vote?
Well, the governor doesn't really have any say in what the legislature does on constitutional amendments, but I think that maybe she might not want to have a statewide vote on abortion rights. If I were an Iowa Republican, I would probably not want to give the people of Iowa a chance to come out and definitively say, you know, we do want our state constitution to protect abortion, because she has been very consistent that she wants to ban, well, the way she puts it, she wants to protect unborn children. And she's trying to revive right now this 2018 abortion ban that she signed that was struck down in 2019. She didn't appeal that decision in 2019 because at the time, the Iowa Supreme Court probably would have affirmed its abortion rights precedent and would almost certainly have struck that law down. So she didn't appeal the law in 2019, but now that she has a majority conservative Iowa Supreme Court, she wants a do-over and she wants to go back and try to bring that law back. But it's interesting that she's trying to resurrect that 2018 law instead of calling the legislature back for a special session to pass a new abortion ban for her to sign. And I think that maybe she doesn't want to maybe some of the Republican legislators don't want to pass an extreme abortion ban like that. And that's why she's just going back to something that already happened, that some of the current legislators weren't serving at that time. So they can't be blamed. They didn't vote for that bill.
Okay, you can take off your Kim Reynolds boots now. They're not good. Yeah, I think of those boots. I think of Joni Ernst, and it's still nobody cares anymore. But every time I get a chance, I remind everybody, putting bread wrappers on your boots. Every farm kid on a mud road with a muddy lot has tried that. I mean, that was just baloney. I mean, because when you do that, the first thing that happens is you step in the mud, the bread wrappers come off, number one. I mean, unless you got them tied on with number 9 baling wire or something like that, you're just not going to keep them on, and they shred and fall apart. That just doesn't work. I mean, that was BS from the beginning. Okay, I digress.
You said that you can put it on the inside. You can put it over
exactly
on the inside of your boots.
Yeah, exactly.
Dry.
All right. Let me. Okay, so this is a story in Bleeding Heartland. Now, you're not going to get this in a lot of other places. The governor is still playing musical chairs with an employment board. Now, this has to do with this kingfish thing that I've talked about before. The kingmaker, this behind the scenes, not playing by the rules. In fact, appears to be breaking the law that Kim Reynolds does and just gets away with. For a second straight year, Governor Kim Reynolds has reappointed Eric Helland to Iowa's Public Employment Relations Board after Helland failed to win Iowa Senate confirmation. In an apparent effort to circumvent the legally required confirmation process, Reynolds appointed Helland to a different position on the 3-member board, which adjudicates labor disputes within state and local governments or school districts. Okay, that part that's in green there, this is all important because I looked at this myself and I Public Employment Relations Board, what's that? Who cares? Well, this is really important, and it should strike fear and dread into the hearts of people, say like union members, right?
Right. I love state government reporting. This to me is near and dear to my heart. And I did think this was an important story. I've had my eye on this story since last summer, and I don't think anybody picked it up when I reported on this last summer or in January. But I think this is important. This Public Employment Relations Board was created in 1974 as part of Iowa's longstanding collective bargaining law. And this has been a process that for decades worked really well. I think representatives of unions and also representatives of government bodies would say that it worked really well. They sometimes mediate, sometimes there's almost like a contested case proceeding. And this 3-member board, they have the final say over these labor disputes that affect hundreds of thousands of teachers and public employees for state or county governments. And so it's the board that doesn't get a lot of media coverage, but it is important. And I have talked to past members of the board. for most of its history, it is operated by consensus. It's been 3 members. Often there have been 2 Republicans and a Democrat, or 2 Democrats and a Republican. And the vast majority of the decisions are unanimous because it hasn't been a highly partisan board. It just has stuck really close to what the code says about collective bargaining and some of these agreements. And this board also oversees the recertification elections, which are now mandatory in every contract period under that 2017 law Republicans passed to try to screw over the teachers union and the state employee unions. So the balloting for that to make sure these bargaining units can exist is overseen by this Public Employment Relations Board. So it is important. So there are a couple of angles of this that I think are worth noting. The first is that this board is supposed to have 3 members. And for the last 2 years, the governor has kept 1 position vacant. She has just opted to not exercise her right to appoint someone. That is very unusual in the history of this board, to have a vacancy that goes on for more than 4 or 6 or 8 months. Sometimes it takes the governor's office a while to get around to filling board positions. That has always been true, but to deliberately keep one vacant for a long time is unusual. And I think the reason why she's done that is anticipating that the Iowa Senate would not confirm her choices. And then because they weren't confirmed to the position they were holding, she can't keep them in that position, but she can appoint them to a different seat on the same board that is open. And that's what she has done now twice with Eric Helland. And I think that she actually did something similar with the State Judicial Nominating Commission, where she reappointed someone who had not been confirmed by the Iowa Senate. So it's just her saying, look, I don't care what the Senate says. I'm going to put whoever I want on that board. And that's not how it's supposed to look. I mean, the board by law, its members are subject to Senate confirmation. And even her own appointment letters of Eric Helland say, please note that this appointment is subject to confirmation by the Iowa Senate. But she obviously doesn't care whether he is or isn't confirmed. And I don't know why she's so set on keeping this one person on the board. I haven't figured out what kind of backstory there is there. There are any number of other Republicans she could appoint to the position, but the fact remains that right now there is a guy there who was not twice. The Iowa Senate chose not to confirm him. And right now the board doesn't even have a quorum because 2 positions are vacant. She hasn't filled even a second position, let alone a 3rd position on the board. So there are other shenanigans going on with that board that I thought are important, and I reported on those in January. But for this post, like what you highlighted, Kingfish Kim, I hadn't heard that. I've heard people say COVID Kim, but not
the Kingfish. Yeah, because she does this kind of stuff behind the scene. And that's it. That's what I'm getting at with this. If this is important enough for her to do this, there's something up, folks. And to review, historically now, this has been a bipartisan board. It's had Democrats and Republicans on it, right?
Yes. And I talked to somebody when I was researching the piece that I published in January. I talked to some past board members, including the longest serving ever person on this Public Employment Relations Board. She was a staffer starting in like 1979. And then she was appointed to the board in 1987 or 8 and served until retiring in around 2010. So she has an enormous institutional knowledge of this board. And she said it was just, she could think of only a handful of times where the board didn't resolve a case unanimously. It was a very collegial board under Democratic and Republican governors. And the collective bargaining law that was in place from 1974 to until 2017, when the Republicans shredded it, it was a really good, fair process. I mean, not everybody always got what they wanted. I think there was, there will always be some complaints about what happens in arbitration. But generally, if you talk to people in the labor unions who dealt a lot with this board, they would say that generally they got a fair shake in front of this board. And that is not the general feeling now. And especially when the Democrats in the Iowa Senate, I mean, it's clear that their view on the governor's appointees just is of no importance at all to the governor.
I got to say this, when I read a story like that, it really takes me back. I mean, one of the first important interviews that I did a long time ago, I interviewed a guy with the Ku Klux Klan in Iowa, an Iowa Ku Klux Klan member. Yeah. And so, I was a kid. I didn't know any different. Man, you must not like black people. Well, yeah, we don't like black people. But, what we're really about here in Iowa is Jewish people. I said, really? Yeah. And so, okay. So fast forward here. I'm not a Republican, never have been. I don't move in Republican circles. I don't have a lot of Republican friends. Forget the Ku Klux Klan thing. I'm not trying to tar them with that brush. But
Mhm.
I remember talking to this. I got to be good friends with a Republican finally, and got to kind of get inside their head a little bit. And I thought, well, you must really be up with the gun rights, and you must really be up with like this abortion issue. No, unions. They
Mm,
really hate unions,
yes.
really want to end unionism. I mean, that's really what it's about. So then when I see somebody like an ideologue like Kim Reynolds, and you wonder what the hell she's doing with this board, it kind of looks to me like she's stacking chips, or she's getting ready to make a move, through this board to do something on unions in this state. Maybe I'm taking that a leap too far, but that's the way it looks to me.
Well, this collective bargaining law was obviously designed to destroy the unions, and it hasn't been successful. But that the way the recertification election rules were very unfair. The way they said that they can't take dues out of people's salaries automatically. They tried to undermine their funding that way. There was one other thing that it didn't come up in my reporting last week, but it was something that I reported in January that I thought was important. So the Public Employment Relations Board has 3 members, 2 regular members, and the chair. And over the course of many decades, and I talked to past people, so that the 2 regular board members were paid a certain salary, and the chair's salary was just a little bit higher. That was the standard. Well, Kim Reynolds, and we've talked about this before in the context of her bonuses for some state agency directors, she likes to appoint the people she likes, and she likes to put them at the very top of the legally allowed pay scale right away. And that's what she's done with Eric Helland when he was first appointed in 2020. Right away, I requested salary records to confirm this. Right away, at the very top of the pay scale that was legally allowed, there was a Democrat serving on the Public Employment Relations Board on that time who had been there for 4 years, and he started at a higher salary than she had. And then in 2021, when the governor replaced that Democrat with a second Republican, that person also immediately was put at the very top of the pay scale, higher than what the Democrat had been receiving after 5 years at that point on the job at the board. So this is not normal. It's not how the board in the past. There were never Democrats or Republicans favored with higher salaries because of their party affiliation. That just had not, that was something that I confirmed had never existed before on this board before Kim Reynolds.
All right, good. We're already past the 40-minute mark, so we're running out of time. I like to try to hold these live lines to within an hour, so we're kind of in the realm of quick hitters. Let me bring this up and try to cover
Okay.
some things. I want to get because Bleeding Heartland's got a plethora of these stories that are great. This one really jumped out at me: a science-based case against carbon dioxide pipelines across Iowa. Now, I've covered this on podcasts by George before. Had the great Emma Schmidt on here talking about these CO2 pipelines, is kind of Cucamonga Warren Mitty idea. Let's see here. 17 academics, farmland owners, and environmental advocates have urged the did I say Warren Mitty? Walter Mitty have urged the Iowa Utilities Board to reject permit applications for a carbon dioxide pipeline that would run across Iowa. July 29th letter to the board, and you can link to that and see it, folks, laid out 4 science-based objections to the projects proposed by Summit Carbon Solutions, Navigator CO2 Ventures, and Archer Daniels Midland, partnered with Carbon Solutions. Okay, so I want to take this down because this really reinforces what I've had on my podcast before about this kind of a nutty idea. The science doesn't support it. But I've got a feeling that the advocates of it don't care about any of that, Laura. What they care about is the money that's going to be generated by it.
This thing is just greenwashing and a way to channel a lot of money toward ethanol producers and these few companies trying to build pipelines. I should say, by the way, that picture that you showed, that was Emma Schmidt's photo. She had posted that on Twitter that she allowed me to use. That it's an example of how this, in that case, it was a farm that was affected by construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and how years later you can see the result of the soil compaction and other issues related to the construction of these pipelines. So I should say I signed this letter. I did not write this letter. Matt Liebman, who is a retired professor of agronomy from Iowa State, took the lead in writing the letter, but when I was offered the chance to sign it, I was proud and happy to sign it, to add my name. Many of the people who signed know a lot more about agriculture and agricultural economics than I do, but it's just really important to cut through, because you hear a lot of nonsense about how it's interesting how some people on the one hand, they sound like climate deniers, but if they can use climate change to try to get money for their industry, they'll try to do that. And that's what's happening with these carbon pipelines. But funneling carbon dioxide from ethanol plants to the ground and sending it to North Dakota, where it may or may not be used for fracking, that is not going to make a dent in our greenhouse gas emissions. It's just clear. And ethanol is not even really a net positive for climate change at all. Although many in Iowa political circles, you often hear that it is part of the climate solution. It really isn't, because the emissions that come out of your tailpipe when your car's running on ethanol, that is going to massively outweigh whatever these pipelines could catch. That's not even mentioned. That letter didn't even get into some of the other problems that people like Emma Schmidt have raised, that there can be explosions or there are safety issues related to these pipelines. And just the justice issue of potentially using the government's eminent domain power to condemn land for something that's just for private profit. There's really no public good associated with these carbon dioxide pipelines. So I do encourage people to read that letter if they can. It is important. And if you ever need talking points, if people say, but well, we've got to do more with ethanol because it can help us fight climate change, that just lays out the numbers that I can't quote off the top of my head, those numbers, but it's just really clear. It's not going to change the equation. We need to have much more significant changes in our transportation and in order to really reduce the greenhouse gases we're sending into the atmosphere.
Well, and our internet connection seems to be degrading here a little bit, unfortunately, but I think folks are getting the gist there. Yeah, check that letter out. And the one thing that I would say kind of struck me, again, I look at things a little bit different than everybody else, but the state universities and these agriculture departments, the people that are criticizing the CO2 pipeline as not being a good deal, well, they're open to criticism themselves as kind of being on the side of big ag. I mean, that's who they instruct and teach in their classrooms. They get funded a lot by big ag. And so a lot of people criticize them for that. But even they're looking at this and saying, now there's no public good in this, as Laura says. I mean, it's going to pollute. It isn't going to solve any problem at all. It's going to cost a lot of money. The only good to come out of this is private good in the way of some big bucks for a very select few investors. Well, I want to get this
and you notice people who signed that letter are hired faculty from Iowa and a lot of current faculty who are willing to speak out against these pipelines. There are some, certainly Sylvia Secchi of the University of Iowa has been on.
She's been on,
of the pipeline. So yeah, she's great. Dave Swenson, now retired, when he was still working at Iowa State, he was a critic. He was a skeptic about some of the ethanol industry's exaggerated claims for job creation and things like that. But for the most part, the state universities, especially Iowa State University, the faculty don't typically come out against something that the big ag interests want.
Okay, let me, because we are about out of time, I wanted to bring this up because we talked about the kingfish, and I don't know why the internet gets progressively worse as we go along. That should not be technologically possible, but it seems to be that way. This is an article not in Bleeding Heartland, but this is in the Des Moines Register this morning. With support from Iowa senators, other Republicans, the U.S. Senate approves the burn pit bill. A lot of people may have seen this because Jon Stewart was involved in this. A bill enhancing health care and disability benefits for millions of veterans exposed to toxic burn pits won final approval in the Senate on Tuesday with the support of Iowa's Republican senators. The vote ended a brief stalemate on the measure that had infuriated advocates and inspired some to camp outside the U.S. Capitol. U.S. Senator Joni Ernst, a veteran, had been among a group of Republican senators to oppose the bill during a vote late last week. She joined U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley in voting to pass it on Tuesday. So let me bring that down off screen, see if we can bring Laura back in here. So we had the kingfish, Laura. Now we got what I call the fish flop with
Yeah,
Joni Ernst. Why would she have been
I am
opposed to
working.
this?
Yep.
Yeah.
I actually was working on a post about this, but then I shifted gears because I thought it was just important for me to write about that Kansas vote right away. But yes, Joni Ernst, Chuck Grassley did vote for this bill in June and again last week and again this week. Joni Ernst was among 25 senators who voted for the bill in June, voted against it last week to stop it from passing, and then turned around and voted for it this week after they just got massive, massive blowback. And I thought it was interesting that in her statement on the bill's passage, she just didn't really acknowledge that she had voted against it last week. She made it sound like she'd always supported it. And she's, of course, a veteran and served in a combat zone herself. So really outrageous to have voted against this bill. And the excuses that the Republican senators made that was related to an arcane budget issue, and it really didn't hold water. It wasn't different from the bill that they voted for in June.
You know how this stuff works. So why would she hold out on that? Why wouldn't she be on board immediately? I don't understand that. That doesn't make any sense. As you mentioned, she's a veteran. She was in a combat area, but I don't want to, make too much of that. She wasn't shooting people. Nobody was shooting at her. I think she was driving a truck in an area that was designated combat, but there weren't any hostilities. But anyway,
but there were trucks though that got hit by
yeah,
IEDs, on roads like
yeah,
that.
that's true. Good, yeah, but
So
I don't know if she was ever around a burn pit, but why would she be why would she not come on as early as Grassley did, as an example?
well, I mean, she did vote for the bill in June. There was a technical problem with the bill, which is why they had to send it back and vote on a different version this month. I mean, what I saw last week, the congressional reporters that I follow, and Jamie Dupree is one of the best ones, he said that when this thing came up for a vote, and it was the day that Joe Manchin said, actually, he and Schumer have a deal on some kind of reconciliation, and the Republicans got very angry. So this was seen as a reaction to just try to stymie part of the agenda. I don't think they thought it through, honestly. I mean, Joni Ernst issued a statement to the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and she tried to say that it was related to it was a budget question, that this burn pits bill would make about $40 billion that had been considered discretionary spending. It would make it mandatory spending, and the Republicans didn't like that. But that was in the bill that she voted for in June. So I don't really think that's why she voted against it last week. I think they just didn't. Like I said, I don't think it was a well thought out strategy. It was perceived as the Republicans not wanting Democrats to have a win on this last week.
I
They
got
were
it.
mad about this reconciliation, which may or may not even happen because Kirsten Sinema may torpedo that one. But in any case, there was so much reaction that this week, when the Democrats brought it back to the floor, these Republicans didn't have the guts to vote against it. Only 11 of them did vote against it, basically the same group who had opposed it in June.
All right. Well, we're out of time. I wanted to bring this up on screen and get to this before we went out of here. Now, this has to do with your newsletters and your weekly radio show. I want you to talk about this a little bit because I'm a big supporter. I want people to follow Bleeding Heartland. I want them to listen to you on the radio. And then also this newsletter that you can, is it weekly? How often does that come out?
So they have a couple of different newsletters now. Bleeding Heartland, all material on Bleeding Heartland is always available 24 hours a day, anytime people want to go to the website, www.bleedingheartland.com. But over the years, some people have said, how can't you just send me an email that has the links? And some people like those news roundups in their email. So 2 or 3 times a week, I have what's called the Evening Heartland newsletter. It contains features all links to all recent articles and commentaries on the website. So if you just want to make sure you didn't miss anything, that's an email people can subscribe to. And then the other email that I have on Substack, this is new that I just started a week or so ago. It's going to be part of, there's a new Iowa Writers Collaborative that Julie Gamick is forming.
Yeah, I heard
It
about that. Yeah.
hasn't officially launched yet, but I'm going to be part of that. So the Substack newsletter is not primarily going to be distributing, it's not going to be duplicating Bleeding Heartland content, but I'm periodically putting up posts there. I'm putting up links to my weekly radio show on KHOI every week. I'm putting up sometimes, like yesterday, I did a post, what I'm reading, which was links to other articles about this Kansas referendum, not by me, but by other people. Last week, I posted a what I'm reading thread that had links to other people's coverage about some of the abortion stories, the interference with healthcare that's happened in states that have banned abortion. So it's just, again, not everyone wants extra emails in their box, but the Substack newsletter is free. The Evening Heartland newsletter is free. And it's just another way for people who like to keep up over email. That's something that they can do if they want to follow me that way.
I'm glad you mentioned Julie Gamick. Working on this project, I got to mention I've tried to work with Julie. I got to get back to it, I guess, on Podluck, Iowa. She wants to do a podcast, and I'm helping her with the technical part of it because Julie and I were on WHO together, but she was not a technical person. She was literally much more so than I. She was talent. I mean, she was the talk show host, and she just sat in front of a microphone. And I came up through small market radio, so I can run these little things behind the scene. But I remember Julie Gamick very fondly. She was kind of like you. I mean, she was really good on the radio. Somebody with a print background, somebody with a famous father, Gordon Gamick, her dad. And I mean, she was really good on WHO radio. And I'll share this little anecdote. You'll get a kick out of this. I remember one time I used to go up there and I would run into the studio to do these live cut-ins all the time on some live breaking news somewhere. I don't know, somebody's house had caught on fire, blown up, a gas explosion or something. But anyway, I made right in the middle of the story, I made a comment or a remark about the housewife. And Julie Gamick stopped me cold. Boy, you do not say housewife. That woman is not married to her home, to her house. That is not I never made that mistake again. I never got on the Julie Gamick show and ever said anything about a housewife. She pinned my ears back pretty good.
Well, pretty good. Well, she has a Substack column that's called Julie Gamick's Iowa Potluck.
Yeah,
very interesting reading, covers a variety of topics. She has weekly Zoom calls. So anyway, I encourage people to check that out if they're Substack people. Again, it's something that you can get for free over email.
Well, we've done a lot of promotion here. I put those URLs up at the end, but I want people to do that. I want you to have the closing comment here because you're so good at it. I mean, kind of wrap it up here for us. Either something we've talked about, Laura, or something that you're working on that people can look for coming down the line here in Bleeding Heartland.
Yeah, well, I'm always working on some other state government stories, and I'm still working on a couple of angles following up on this abortion vote. But I think it's interesting that the governor, although she says that she wants to resurrect this 2018 abortion ban, I think they still haven't filed the court motion on that. And I think they might be slow walking it a little bit to maybe get beyond the November election. It makes me think that this is something that they maybe don't want the courts to act on too quickly before the election. It just makes me wonder, because if it's that high a priority, I wonder why she hasn't filed the motion already. This has been more than a month since she said that she wanted to try to bring this 2018 abortion ban back.
Well, you write it. I'll be reading it. I should listen to the radio show. If I get a chance to do that, I'll do it as well. But for right now, anyway, as always, Laura, thanks again for coming on a podcast by George Liveline.
Oh, thank you. Yes, the KHOI radio show on khoifm.org. All of the past shows are on their website. Dennis Hart is my partner on the show. He is great to work with. He is a radio and TV broadcast journalism guy and now retired, but he volunteers his time to KHOI. And it's just really enjoyable for us to have a platform to dig in and talk about Iowa politics for 30 minutes every Monday.
My God. And you can do it. I'm telling you, that way she is articulate. Again, Laura, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, George.
All right, folks, we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to leave it there with Laura Belin. Now, she's a regular. She comes on every so often. We've kind of been in the summer doldrums here, so she hasn't been on quite as often as normal, but things will be heating back up, particularly when the legislature gets back in session and they start doing their hijinks. I mean, she's all over that, and of course, she's following the governor's office always, and we'll get that news from Laura. And if you like Podcast by George, please go to podcastbygeorge.com and ring the notification bell here. Let me see if I can bring that little thing up on the screen here. How do I do? Okay, here we go. So let me click here. Let me go here. And oh, that's not it. I'm having technical difficulties here. Okay, it's in the slides. I like to show this because it illustrates what you do if you go to Podcast by George, the home. Okay. And there it is. All right. I knew I could do it. All right. So, folks, that's podcastbygeorge.com. And that is the row of icons, the little buttons that you can click. And if you choose Facebook or YouTube, you'll be seeing the videos and the live streams like we're doing today. But then if you choose the other platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, places like that, you'll be signed up and get the audio versions of the podcast when they release. And it's usually, just a few hours after we do the live videos. But folks, let me bring me back in here and thank you again for watching. I'm going to let everybody know that that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.